Hello, everyone. It's Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm back with my long-term colleague and friend, Eytan Sheshinski, who I believe is one of the world's top economists and the senior economist of Israel. He was our third Economics Matters, the podcast guest, along with a colleague who from the Knesset, who was a long time member of the Committee on Security and I guess Defense Sector. This is Yuval Steinitz, if I recall.
Yes.
And we had a terrific discussion of Israel's new gas field that they're starting to develop and their potential for assisting Europe in substituting away from Russian energy supplies. But today I want to talk to Eytan about what's going on in Israel with the interaction with the Palestinians and how things are evolving politically, because at the time we were speaking, I think we had a moderate centrist government. We now have a right-wing government. And maybe you could kind of take us back over, Eytan, we'll start us out by giving us some history of the politics of Israel for the last maybe 10 years and how we got to where we are, where we have people in the cabinet that seem to be so extreme, and where we have the prime minister trying to change the laws, regulations regarding the judiciary, the Supreme Court, so that the politicians can in effect, hobble the Supreme Court and pass whatever laws they like without any real judicial review. Anyway, take it away. Tell us where things have gotten and what's going on with bring us up to the current day and the current conflict that's happening.
Yeah, glad to talk to you, Larry. And Israel is in perhaps the worst situation for a long time, and a very problematic government and issues of governance, and the whole structure of governance in Israel is at question. And you have seen that people who came out for 17 or more weeks in a row, hundreds of thousands for Israel, this is a significant portion of the 7 million people or so, several hundred thousand every Saturday night in various towns and cities in the country to demonstrate against what I'll come to, so-called the judicial reform, which Netanyahu plans. So let me backtrack, as you asked, and say that to my mind, it all started when Netanyahu was put to trial on several counts of including bribery, a serious element of bribery and misconduct in office. Three files, three accusations, three parts of this. This trial has been going on now for years, since 2015, and that fact, I think, explains a lot about his behavior since then, because Netanyahu, early on, he's now for 15 or so years prime minister at the helm in Israel. He was the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel, surpassing David Ben-Gurion. And his legacy now seems to be very, very problematic. And it all started by putting him to trial on these various accusations. Now, they are misconduct in office and bribery from a newspaper trying to provide some benefits of governance. The details are unimportant, but the fact is that there are the Attorney General has been able to bring as key witnesses some of his Netanyahu's ex-aides and ministers and so forth, and it seems unlikely that he will be completely absolved of all the accusations. He will certainly be tried on some, and I'll come back to that because a deal is now rumored to be in the making on this. So since 2015, when the Attorney General brought forward the accusations against Netanyahu, his behavior has changed dramatically. Israel went through the last 2 years, 5 elections in a row, because Netanyahu was unable to form a government, and nobody was willing to share the podium with Netanyahu. The slogan was, only not Netanyahu. You cannot trust this guy, and so most of the center-left parties certainly were running on the slogan of they will be willing to form coalitions, but not under the leadership of a person who is put to trial. Of course, various proposals have been put forward to have, like the French law, you cannot, and the US, you cannot put the president to trial so long as he's serving, only afterwards. But for that, you need a certain also limit on timing on how many times can a prime minister, or in the case of France, the president, be serving. And in France, I think it is twice or so, and then you can put him to trial, but not while he is serving. And you can see some logic to this.
Right.
He must be devote all his time to the state affairs, at least presumably. And in Israel, we don't have that. Neither do we have a constitution, which will, and I'll come back to that because this is the essence of what's happening nowadays in Israel. So Netanyahu has, as I said, has been serving now for 15 years, more or less, with some short interval in between with Ehud Barak as prime minister. And he and his partners, and increasingly, he could canvass only the support of the ultra-Orthodox parties and even more right-wing parties than he is, and that's the composition of the current government. I'll come back to it. So when they won the election,
let me ask you one quick question. If right now the prime minister can be put on trial or indicted, why hasn't that happened? It's been, you said this investigation's been.
No, they said they are willing to do that, but if he will agree for a limit on the terms, on number of terms that he can serve. If Netanyahu would agree, for example, on 3 terms maximum, and in the past, by the way, he was for it. He said, I'm for limit terms on, in the US, after FDR, this was changed to twice. You can run twice.
But the law right now does not allow a sitting prime minister to be indicted. Is that the story?
No, we don't have a law on that. And they said that we are willing to have it. The opposition said, the opposition to Netanyahu was willing to do it, but in return for a limit on the terms.
Okay, but given that you don't have a law, why doesn't the state prosecutor, attorney general go right ahead and indict the guy right now? Why isn't he?
The trial has been going on now for a number of 3 years already in a row, and it's not, the end is not in sight.
Why is it taking?
And he will appeal to the Supreme Court and so forth. This will take 5, 6, 7 years.
Why is it taking so long? I guess is my question.
There are various witnesses who have been brought in, whose testimonies, these are so-called the key witnesses who turned against Netanyahu, and they have been they are brought by the prosecution to testify that Netanyahu has on the misconduct, that he actually asked for favors from, for example, for editors, from owners of the media and so forth in return for some economic advantages that he can receive. And I don't think there's a good chance that he will be absolved of all the accusations. He may be of some, perhaps the bribery.
But I still don't get why a trial like this, which seems to have a finite number of issues, takes 8 years. It just doesn't say. I mean,
It's not ending. 8 is you're optimistic. It will take longer because Netanyahu will certainly appeal. If he's convicted, he will appeal to the Supreme Court. This will be another 2-3 years.
But at least the conviction should happen. Why has it not been brought to? Why has the trial not, the initial trial not ended with an answer? I mean, of course, in the U.S.
it's still going on. Netanyahu, of course, has been saying that he is busy in the affairs of the state and has not been willing to intensify the number of sessions in the court and so forth. He used all the possible means that he had to stretch the timing as much as possible.
And the judge is not insisting on bringing this to a close. You're saying
the judges are not insisting. No, there are hundreds of witnesses who are going to testify still in line. I don't know how many of them will actually testify, but some people are coming from overseas and so forth, like Milchan, about personal bribery and gifts that Netanyahu received in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, he and his wife and his family. There are various accusations, but there's no point in getting into those. Basically, a number of accusations about misconduct in office, and the testimonies seem to be there and cannot be refuted altogether. Maybe some will not be accepted, or he will be absolved on reason of doubt.
So he's able to just basically not tell the courts you cannot proceed because I'm prime minister. Is that really what's going on?
Well, basically in terms of timing of sessions and the intensity of sessions and so forth, he certainly wanted to stretch the affair for as long as he could. And in the meantime, of course, there was an appeal to the Supreme Court that a person who is under trial cannot run for prime ministership. And the Supreme Court has denied that. The law in Israel does not allow, for example, you cannot be a principal of school or an army officer or anybody who is indicted, but the law absolved specifically the prime ministership. And so the Supreme Court approved his running, even though under trial, and he was, and for 5 elections in Israel, which is again unprecedented in the last 2 years, there was no clear outcome until the last elections. Then he won quite big. Big, I mean 64 out of the 120. He ran the coalition. He canvassed the coalition, which has 64 votes out of 120. So a slim majority. But the previous government, a year and a half before that, had only 61, which was even worse because everyone has a sort of, so to speak, a veto power on the government, so to speak. And that's exactly what happened. Netanyahu was able to take some of these people lure them away from the government, from the previous coalition. Anyway, in the last elections, he won together with the kind of coalition that he canvassed. And the only coalition, given the standing of all the parties, center and left, where he could canvass only the ultra-Orthodox who went with him all the way. And they got quite a number of votes in Israel. And I'll come back to it. That's the demographic issue means that the forecast is that they'll even increase their voting power, their clientele, in the course of time, and together with some splinter parties on the right, which are really extreme and have been denied actually running to the Knesset in the past on grounds of by Supreme Court on the grounds of illegal claims and racist attitude towards the Arab population, but now they are his partners. In fact, the head of that party, one of the two heads of this party, there are two heads. One is the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, and the other one is the Minister of the Police, so-called now National Security, Ben-Gvir, who was convicted 8 times on some minor things. And these are, you're talking about the extreme right in Israel, which in the past has been denied running on racist grounds and now is allowed. So you can see the trend. The trend is certainly to the right, more racist, more intolerance in Israel, that the election campaigns have been more extreme, more nasty, more vulgar. Well, I must say, you in the US also understand this quite well, given the recent divisive elections in the US and the disputes about the elections. But the big difference is Israel does not have a constitution. So there is no, the Supreme Court cannot go, there are no limits, natural limits to the power of the executive. You see, in Israel, the executive runs the Knesset because he has a coalition, a majority. So basically the executive branch is dominating the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, has been the only force that was potentially able to balance the power. Netanyahu understood that, and he started a campaign against the overweight, as he put it, the overweight of the Supreme Court, of the judicial branch over the Knesset, because they overruled a number of the laws that the Knesset tried to pass, and they overruled that. And now he campaigned in the last election, which he won, on the fact that he will restrict the power of the. But you see, all these issues were rather vague during the campaign, I can say, and the public did not understand. Once he won, the Likud and his partners, the current government, went out shooting with all the cannons they have in all directions. And the issue of governance and the judicial reform is only one of them. The other is of course, what they have to pay, quote unquote, the Orthodox parties, who this time really exceed any of their demands. They want independence of their educational system. I'll come back to that, but let's stay with the judicial reform, so-called the judicial revolution, overturning the government by basically concentrating all power in the hands of the executive. So, for example, one of the issues is the committee that chooses the justices, Supreme Court justices. Until now was 3 Supreme Court justices who were on this committee, then 2 representing the Lawyers Association in Israel, and then 3 or so politicians and some from the public. So 9 members, and you needed, according to the most recent reform, 7 out of 9 to agree on a certain justice. And this, they wanted to annul this and to change the composition of this committee that chooses the Supreme Court justices, so that the executive branch, the government, an existing government with 61 votes, even if they have only 61 out of 120, they can overturn and totally choose the new justices on the Supreme Court, and 2 or 3 of their seats are going to be vacated soon, so they will have an absolute majority in the Supreme Court. This is so-called the judicial reform. And then the Israeli public is talking, the slogan of the anti-government, this campaign, the judicial reform, which they call a campaign against democracy, they call it the reigning of dictatorship. The examples that brought up in Israel is always that Hungary and Poland, 2 European countries, which also more or less annulled the power of the judicial system,
Yeah, yeah.
and academia and others. So they say Israel will be like Erdogan, like Turkey, and like Hungary, and like Poland. And amazingly, the positive thing, which has not happened, by the way, in these countries that I just mentioned, is how many hundreds of thousands of Israelis went out to the streets demonstrating week after week. Hundreds of thousands in Israel. This is unprecedented. Rain, heat, whatever the weather, and so forth, coming out with Israeli flags and saying, we will not serve in the army, we will not go, and so forth, unless you cancel, you abolish the judicial reform that you plan. And it was successful so far, in the sense that Netanyahu, under protest by some of the top, the army, the participation of reservists in the Air Force, pilots, which are in Israel, sort of the top of the line, pilots and intelligence people and so forth, the unit 8,200. Anyway, this is all, Israelis understand these numbers and these meanings. When they came out with a letter that they will not be willing to volunteer for reserve duty, that has made a tremendous impact on the Minister of Defense from Netanyahu's party and on Netanyahu himself. So basically, to cut it short, he is now, the process has been frozen, and there are negotiations in the president's house, President Herzog's house. Usually the president has just some ceremonial power in Israel, unlike in the US, for example, but this time he can play some role. And the two-party, Netanyahu and the opposition, are having negotiations which are going nowhere, I may say, up to this point. And therefore, I cannot predict what will happen in a week or two, when it will be clear that they could not agree on the major points, like the overruling, the ability of the Supreme Court to overrule Knesset decisions when they are considered non-constitutional, unacceptable to basic laws. Israel has 5 basic laws which are considered to be the foundation for a future constitution. But and in all its history, the Supreme Court has now rejected, I think, 21 times the decisions by the Knesset. But anyway, this has been going on, the judicial reform.
What fraction of the population is opposed to this judicial reform? I mean, you're saying
at least half, but I would say more. The polls show that if elections were held today, with all the reservations we have for polls, when no elections are in sight at this point, officially at least, every 4 years we have elections, and we just had election half a year ago. So at this point, the polls show that Netanyahu's coalition will not have a majority anymore. They lost about 20% of their power, but on the people, including in Netanyahu's party. There are quite a number, I think about 40% of the people in Netanyahu's party who voted for Netanyahu at the time said they would not vote for him today. So Netanyahu, who is a smart guy, understands this, and therefore he froze the process at this point.
So can someone force a new election? How does this, what's the process?
Well, if the government falls. So, okay, the relevant issue now is the budget for the next 2 years. We have a biannual budget, and the budget will have to be approved within the next 2 weeks until the end of this month. And if it is not approved, then the government falls automatically, and then there will be elections. So the budget will be approved. Netanyahu has the votes at this point, it seems, and the budget will be approved. The question is what next? Because Israel is now full with the news about the composition of this proposed budget. And the main issue is the ultra-Orthodox demands for 2 things. A, the independence of the fact that they are not serving in the army. They want this to be ironclad, to have a basic law, what they call, which can be repealed only with a supermajority, that they will not serve in the army. Currently, they also don't serve in the army, but they have to stay in a yeshiva, in a religious school, until the age of 26, and then they can enter the labor force, which they don't anyway. Only about 50% of men, were Orthodox men between 25 and 65 years old, are in the labor force. The majority of them are staying as learning all their life and so forth, but of course being supported by the state. And it's interesting, by the way, Larry, as we as economists, people made comparisons between the Orthodox communities in New York, Crown Heights, and other areas, and they say what is the proportion of men who do not work in those quarters in New York, which are also inhabited by a majority of Hasidim, of ultra-Orthodox, and you see the overwhelming majority does go to work. So in short, incentives work, what economists have been claiming all along, and therefore the government support of the Orthodox schooling system, the fact that they don't teach what is called the core subjects like English, mathematics, biology, and so on, nothing, only Talmud, only religious teachings. This is another demand by the Orthodox parties not to touch this, allow their independence and non-inclusion. The state originally wanted to include by force, and otherwise the budgets would have been withdrawn from their system. And by the way, recently in New York, if you notice, the U.S. in New York State, I forget what authority, said on Hasidic schools in New York, in Crown Heights, that if they don't teach some basic subjects, they will withdraw the support of the state for Crown Heights. So not dissimilar. But in Israel, this is a major issue. And the second issue, which I started saying, is they're not serving in the army. And now my personal opinion is I'll go along with them. The army anyway after they have not been, they don't have the qualifications for being in the army in the top, say, technical units or intelligence units, given their schooling system, as I said, and certainly they will not volunteer to the top echelon units. That I'm willing to go along with that, although many see it as a real moral issue, which can.
So what fraction of the population at this point is Orthodox
Orthodox? You have about, if you count just the religious parties, maybe about 20%. But you know the demography. If you look at the forecast for the number of people, and you look by age, you see that as you go to the younger ages, since the 7 children per family average for Orthodox families, 7. Well, the average for Israel is 2.1, I think, or something around that number. Okay, so clearly the future is on their side in terms of numbers, and they increasingly depend on the support of the state. And this is something which is not sustainable. This is not sustainable, and even they understand it, but they have no way to, and not the willpower to.
So how do you see things evolving, resolving? Do you think Netanyahu is going to be able to force through this judicial reform? Do you think would this just lead to a complete civil war in some sense, or
I hate to talk about civil war. Israel has not been. So even the protests by the pilots, several thousand of the pilots on reserve duty, not in active duty. Nobody in active duty is allowed in the army to enter politics, to make political statements. But those who are on reserve, they are still serving intensively to be fit for duty, for combat duty when called. And the pilots is a very important part. So not only pilots, intelligence people in top units, cyber units, and so forth, all these units, when they announce that they will not serve, not volunteer, because what they serve is a day, a month or so, even after they finish the army and the service, they're still in the army in many ways and serving above and beyond the call of duty. That has created a real problem. That has, to my mind, has swayed Netanyahu to freeze the process at this point. But it's still hanging out there, and it affects the economy as well. And in fact, Larry, you should know that the economists in Israel have been the activating force to start with and have been the pioneers in this protest movement. A letter signed by hundreds of economists, basically the whole academic community, community of academic economists in Israel, has signed a letter saying that the judicial reform will also hurt the economy because the uncertainty and the fact that the executive branch rules and there's no division of power anymore among the traditional three branches, this will have a negative effect on the high-tech. The high-tech sector's export are now 50% of Israel's export. And the investment and 25% of the labor force is working in high-tech, in the high-tech sector. So the protest by these guys was very effective and still is effective to prevent the judicial reform if anybody thinks to renew it. I don't think it will happen at this point.
So let me talk about the relationships with the Palestinians and what's going on with the current conflict and also Iran. Where do you see things now and going? Where do you see them going?
Well, it's going nowhere. And so for a while, Netanyahu's policy was to, and to some extent it was successful. I'll explain. It was to freeze the situation, the status quo. Let's continue with the status. We are doing quite well under current arrangement. We are the occupiers of the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza, we are not the occupiers, but de facto, we determine what will happen in Gaza. And given the coalition from the composition of the coalition that Netanyahu has now, there's not with right-wing parties who are all against, are in favor of so-called the Greater Israel, in other words, increase the settlements and so forth. There will be no serious discussion on any kind of settlements. I don't think there was a chance anyway. You know, Abu Mazen, the head of the Palestinian Authority, who is the most moderate, relatively speaking, among the Palestinians, is quite old and will have to be replaced in the near future. And so I don't know. There's no serious discussions with the Palestinians about solving either the problem of Gaza. First, they have to decide whether they go along. It was as one entity, Gaza and the West Bank, separated by Israel. Yes, how will the negotiations be conducted? And although, as I said in passing before, I said Netanyahu was somewhat successful in the past by the so-called the Abraham agreements with the Gulf states, with some Gulf Emirates, with Bahrain and other and the Emirates, with the Emirates. So that was success. But all these relations are also frozen at this point, totally frozen. There was some declarative, there was some value to it, and some economic ties have started being formed. But at this point, it seems, given the composition of the government, and we just had yesterday so-called the Jerusalem Day, which is unifying the city after the 6-day war in '67, but this was all poking an eye poking a finger in the eye of the Palestinians. The parade is always totally by the settlers who come to Jerusalem to celebrate that. So to answer your question, I answered in a long way, roundabout way, but basically nothing is happening with respect to the Palestinian question at this point. The best one can hope for is the status quo, but I don't think the status quo is tenable in the long run, and something will have to be done, probably not by this government, by the next government.
Has anybody brought forth a resolution, an arrangement that would actually be stable and make sense for both sides? Is this problem just intractable? Do we have? I mean, one issue is that we have extremists on both sides, but another issue is if we had moderates on both sides, how would a two-state solution look?
Well, I think basically, but the moderates agree on the blueprint of the two-state solution. Basically, The majority of the West Bank will be a part of a Palestinian state. But see, the issues are the details, and always God is in the details. Yes. So this will be a state with some features of an independent state, and others, and they will be limited though, in their military power, in their right to sign agreements, military agreements with other Arab countries, which may be used against Israel. In other words, Israel needs insurance policy, and any agreement, but I think it's not infeasible. To my mind, I think this is in principle could be done, but there's no will on Israel's side, and at this point, also not on the Palestinian side. So the Palestinian state, Netanyahu himself said at one point that he's for a two-state solution, but now with about 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, how will the West Bank look like? I don't think that anybody has the power, the political power, the police power to evacuate those settlements that are there. Half a million people are living now. Israelis are living in the West Bank and increasing in number by this government, by supporting them and providing them incentives, economic incentives. So I don't know what the features will be. Probably it will be a Palestinian state with some special arrangements, extraterritorial arrangements for the settlements. I don't think the evacuation of the current settlements in the short run is feasible politically, and therefore it will be a Palestinian state with some extraterritorial security arrangements.
Let's go to the U.S. and how much leverage does the U.S. have on how much damage Netanyahu can produce? I mean, if is Biden under just discreetly telling Netanyahu that look, our support for the country is going to end if you continue pushing this?
I don't think he will say end, but Larry, you are familiar with what happens in the Democratic Party. You have a so-called progressive element in the Democratic Party increasing in strength to some extent, although still an overwhelming majority of the Democrats are supporting Biden, yes, and not with the so-called with Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren and others, and Octavio Cortez and others. So the situation in the U.S. with respect to Israel's relation with the U.S., Biden has made a statement which was quite blunt for Biden when he was asked on his way to the airport, will he invite Netanyahu for a visit since his election? His answer was very short. No. He said, no, I will not. This is very unusual for Biden to say that without some diplomatic, we'll find a time or any. There was no attempt to wishy-wash to avoid the issue. He said no. So I think basically Biden is, of course, there's no love lost between Biden and Netanyahu. Whether as elections in the U.S. are coming closer, whether Biden will feel compelled to invite Netanyahu eventually because of the Jewish vote and so forth, it's hard to say. But there's no question that at this point, relations are quite on a limb. With the Republicans, things are different, of course, at this point. Mm-hmm. Republicans have overwhelming support of the current government in Israel, Trump in foremost, those who support Trump. And overall, Israel is still supported bipartisanly in the U.S., but I can see an erosion in the Democratic Party for sure, and in general in the public, yes. Well, certainly in academia, you can see that.
So let me bring our conversation kind of towards a conclusion, but I want to, by focusing on Iran and bring us up to date on the threat, the nuclear threat from Iran, the long-range missile threat, how you see Iran interacting with Russia, interacting, in their opposition, in their joint opposition, effectively against Ukraine.
Yes.
You see, and Syria, do you see like this coalition in Syria, Iran, Russia forming against Ukraine and also Israel, and do you see the U.S. the negotiations for restarting this treaty have not succeeded? Are the Iranians intensifying their efforts to produce a nuclear weapon?
Yes.
Where do things stand?
Well, again, Netanyahu is the culprit in many ways. You remember his speech before the Congress, the two houses together at the time, and eventually Trump canceled the agreement with Iran, and this has accelerated, actually, in fact, the Iranian efforts to purify uranium, and now estimates are that they are close to several months or so forth before they have bomb grade uranium. But once you have a grade, the highest grade of uranium needed for a bomb, there will be 2 more years at least until. So it's a trigger state. They call it the trigger, a trigger situation where they can go out of the gate, but not yet do things for, say, a year or 2. But it's close. It's close. Israel has been, well, according to foreign sources, Israel has never admitted of doing kind of clandestine operations in Iran, but certainly it is doing, certainly against Iran's attempts to solidify their power in Syria. And so Israel has been attacking supplies from Iran to Assad quite successfully. No question, we have we are dominating the air. Yes, the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force is the most powerful element in the Middle East at this point, and we have been postponing and destroying some of these supplies, but not all. And so we have still Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, Hamas, the recent incident or campaign against jihad, a smaller group than Hamas in the Gaza Strip, was quite indicative in the sense that they have lobbed about 1,500 or so rockets into Israel, but only 1 Israeli was killed. And so basically what I'm saying, it's quite primitive. Hezbollah has a much more accurate arsenal of missiles, and it's more serious. And there's a sort of a balance of power between Israel, Hezbollah, Russia. It's a complicated situation, as you know, Larry, when Iran supplies Russia with drones against Ukraine and so forth. This is all a give and take, a rather complicated situation, which we can only watch and hope for to turn out well for Israel.
Okay, well, this has been a great update on Israel. I really appreciate Eytan, you're coming on, and we're going to keep in touch on this. And
thank you, Larry.
I wish the best, hope for the best in Israel. I obviously Israel's viewed as the only democracy in the Middle East, needs to stay that way for sure. And
yes,
that's the same for the U.S. We're the only.
Let me end with what I said before, which was surprising to me. I've been watching, an observer in this situation for too many years to remember. But this kind of rising of the Israeli center left from that part of the population which is economically active, paying the taxes and so forth, going out to the streets, 17 weeks in a row, hundreds of thousands in all and in towns which have been voting Netanyahu and so forth, shows that Israel still has a strong civil population that will not allow Israel the democracy in Israel to be eroded.
Well, amen to that.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay. Shalom, Leit Rahut, and we'll
Shalom.
talk
Thank
soon.
you, Larry. Take care.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.